Good day. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, Legal Advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa, also known as 4SA. Joining me today is 4SA's Executive Director, Michael Swain, to discuss some groundbreaking news regarding comprehensive sexuality education, also known as CSE. Good day, Michael.
Hi, Daniela. Great to be with you, and we're going to have a good chat this morning about this matter.
Wonderful. So, Michael, CSE is back in the news following a meeting where representatives from our South African government were in New York City early in September, from the 16th to the 19th of September 2022, for the United Nations Transforming Education Summit. Can you give us some background and tell us about the purposes of this meeting?
Well, yes, South Africans will obviously remember that the Department of Basic Education was taken to task in 2019 when they tried to introduce new content on comprehensive sexuality education in public schools without proper consultation with either parents or teachers. And we know that, of course, the Department of Education can set the CAPS curriculum. In other words, they can define the subjects and the outcomes that they want, but they cannot pick the content with which they want to teach it, particularly in an area like sex and sexuality, which is obviously much more value-laden than mathematics, that 1 + 1 will always equal 2. And again, the DBE nevertheless kept on pushing this issue, and they pushed it again in 2021. And the goal is to implement a global standard to teach all children in this area of sex and sexuality. And again, it's in the headlines, and it hasn't gone away, particularly after this New York meeting. And the primary purpose of the New York meeting was to ratify a 5-year plan to implement the United Nations CSE program. And South Africa, and significantly 9 other traditionally conservative African nations, had already signed up for this in July 2022, this year, in a meeting at Lusaka in Zambia. And what this effectively is doing is it's going to give the United Nations full authority to overhaul the national sex education programs of these countries, and thereby to infuse its clearly ideologically biased sexual agenda into the public school systems. And I think it's worthwhile remembering as well that from the last dialogue we had on this, USAID has already given South Africa $25 million. That's nearly 450 million rand to roll this out in South Africa. So it really is something which, again, is right back in the headlines, and about which I think we should be very concerned.
So, Michael, why, when you say we should be very concerned, maybe explain to our viewers why they should be concerned about the UN CSE programs. You mentioned that they were value-laden. Maybe tell us more about this.
Well, the new focus on CSE comes in the form of, I think, an upgraded or updated program on CSE that the United Nations launched in 2019, and it's called the Education Plus Initiative. And it includes basically universal access to CSE, and particularly the fulfillment of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this whole emphasis on sexual rights is very concerning. And it's based, of course, upon UNESCO's highly controversial ITGSE, stands for International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. And this has come under severe criticism. I mean, number one, we know that one of the main groups that actually imparted or inputted into this guidance is International Planned Parenthood, which is the largest abortion provider, and has recently been in the headlines for doing horrific things like selling baby parts, for example. I mean, what agenda do people have when they're actually developing information or education on sex and sexuality, if that is their business? It's obviously going to have a very strong bias. And it's particularly very liberal in the value system that it presents and in the type of comprehensive sexuality content that it recommends. So look, it can always be argued that some level of education on sex should be taught in schools. But again, to say it is impossible to teach on sex and sexuality without integrating values and ideological viewpoints in what is being taught. And that is absolutely not government's responsibility. The schools in this country, and in all public schools in all countries, should be ideologically neutral. Government has no business in pushing some form of ideology into the public school system. That is very much an area which should be left to parents, to teachers, and typically it is the school governing bodies in public schools that are the guardians and the gateways. But now it would seem, if the UN is able to almost overhaul this whole content and the government has somehow signed up for this new initiative, that this is going to again be a battleground.
So, Michael, I remember back in 2019 when we went through the Department of Basic Education's scripted lesson plans and education guides, which is the guides that they wrote for teachers to make sure that this is how the content is taught, and then workbooks for the kids to work through. We were very shocked at the emphasis on sexual pleasure as a right, and the pursuit of that, the emphasis on that, without proper emphasis on rights, on duties and responsibilities and consequences. And we spoke about the fact how this is something that falls squarely within values that parents need to teach their children. And you've now mentioned the fact that this is ideologically driven, the ITGSE, with obviously Planned Parenthood's vested interest in drafting that. Can you tell us why this is a religious freedom issue? What does parents teaching their children values about sexual conduct and so forth, what does that have to do with religious freedom?
Well, the constitutional right to religious freedom, which is guaranteed by Section 15, as you know, is deeply entwined with parental rights, because one of the rights that parents have is to transfer their values and their faith to their own children. And if you intervene with that, if you basically come and cut through that, you can literally cut off the opportunity of parents to pass their faith on to their children in a single generation. And one of the most critical things that you learn as a child, as you grow up, particularly as you come into puberty and as you develop and as you become, if you like, growing into your own sexuality, what you learn about sex and sexuality at a highly impressionable stage of your development fundamentally impacts your views on relationships, on marriage, on family, and therefore on future generations. And it is because of the almost centrality of that teaching and that understanding on sex and sexuality, that's why this area of teaching on sex and sexuality has historically been left to the parents of the child, because parents know their children best. Parents know when their child should learn. Often when you're teaching your child, or your child is, it's in response to questions your child is asking. You're not pushing on them. And schools typically have been left with the business of teaching about the biology of sex. But unfortunately, as we are increasingly seeing, the United Nations, and now with the support of governments and public school education systems, they believe that they know better than you what your child needs to learn about sex and sexuality. And that is deeply concerning, because it will have a lifetime impact upon them.
It is deeply concerning, because just as you're talking, I'm thinking about the fact that, you know, the teacher who teaches these things isn't going to be the one who walks with that child through the rest of that child's life, through the consequences of the decisions made at the age of 9, 10, 12, 16, 18. It's going to be the parents, that child's family, and the rest of that child's social community that has to walk with that child through that. So it makes sense that parents and the community that the child finds themselves in are the ones that teach the sexual ethics and conduct it with the right emphasis, not just emphasizing sexual pleasure at any cost, but the duties and responsibilities and consequences that go with it. So, Michael, what are the main concerns that some parents may have about the UN's version of CSE being taught in schools? We've already mentioned that the UN's version of CSE is based on the International Technical Guidelines on Sexuality Education, the ITGSE, which Planned Parenthood helped draft, and so forth. Why should parents be concerned about the version of content that the UN is pushing?
Well, one of the things that is being taught as part of the whole CSE teachings is on what is now becoming known as, radical gender ideology. In other words, this ideology essentially is exactly that. It says that whoever you believe yourself to be in terms of your own gender, that is who you are, that is who you must be. You must be treated as that, you must be respected as that, you can change your name, your pronouns, your dress, and what have you. And yes, there may be a place for that, but the fact of the matter is if that's being pushed as something that is real and standard and always should be and has been. That is absolutely wrong. We have had all of human history a view of gender that is opposite to that, and therefore it is an ideology. So while yes, people who may be suffering from gender dysphoria should be protected and respected and certainly kept from harm and bullying, to teach this thing factual is causing unnecessary confusion to children, and that is one of the main reasons why parents are concerned about it. And also, as you mentioned, they're unhappy about explicit and often age inappropriate CSE teachings on sex and sexual pleasure and the encouragement of children to explore their sexuality, when probably in many cases they may be far too young to properly understand it. So although, again, the premise for CSE, and you'll often see this, is it's pushed as, well, it's going to prevent bullying, it's going to prevent unwanted pregnancy, it's going to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. But we need to also understand that it also promotes things like, for example, the right to abortion, if a baby should be conceived in the process. So there are a lot of issues where it's coming in between parents and in between them and their children and their opportunity, even their right to teach their children on these things. Instead, it's being given to the schools and it's being rolled out and it's backed by, as I say, government and international agencies.
It makes you think about the emphasis adopted and ideological positions adopted in the content. If you are pushing things that make abortion seem like it's a contraceptive method, if abortion agencies are the ones involved in the drafting of the ITGSE, then there's big question marks about that as soon as money becomes involved. So, Michael, have these programs been tested to see if they actually effectively address the problems such as preventing HIV/AIDS, gender-based violence, commonly known as GBV, teenage pregnancy, and so forth amongst learners? Do they actually solve the problems they so purportedly address?
Well, this is where I think you see ideology trumping actual outcomes, because the Institute for Research and Evaluation has done an analysis on UNESCO, that is the United Nations' own data, and it is proven in 2018, 2019, these studies were made using their own data, that instead of reducing instances of teenage pregnancy and HIV transmission and sexual diseases and what have you, it's had the absolute opposite effect. And in fact, implementing these CSE programs in schools actually carries the risk of additional harm to children, far from reducing the harm that is supposedly coming against them. And we're not trying to minimize that, by the way, but we're just saying that this proven evaluation shows that this is simply not working. And this negative trend, by the way, was even more pronounced in the African context, where 89% of African schools where CSE programs were implemented along these lines failed to demonstrate effectiveness. And interestingly enough, over a quarter showed that there were even greater negative impacts on learners' sexual health. There was an increase in earlier sexual debuts. There was an increase in the number of sexual partners and even rape. And as a result, instead of decreasing, things like HIV and other STIs actually increased in those contexts. So no, it's not a magic wand. It's not a silver bullet, which is often purported to be or pushed out to be. It is actually something which is demonstrably and evidentially carries an even greater risk than the more perhaps leaving things as they were, leaving it to parents, leaving it in the traditional way.
So Michael, why do you think that people of faith, having covered the consequences that you just mentioned now about these programs being rolled out, and we've mentioned that parents and communities are going to be the ones who walk through the rest of the child's life, far into them being an adult, the decisions that a child makes at such a young age. Why do you think that people of faith, religious people, should be concerned about the continuing push to teach the UN's version of CSE in schools?
It's a very interesting question, because obviously on the one hand, as parents, if you have a liberal view of sex and sexuality, then you would probably be equally upset and offended if a very conservative, a traditional view of sex and sexuality was being taught in schools.
Exactly.
And again, that's another very good reason why it should be left to parents to teach their children their values rather than having something pushed down upon them. And again, I think the problem here is that we often talk about developing African solutions for African problems. But here, what's happened is that our government and these other national governments have embraced this Western ideology that will teach children about sex and sexuality in a way that is really seriously disconnected from and even in conflict with the faith and the beliefs and the interests of their parents. And, people, again, who affirm that traditional values like celibacy before marriage and that even male and female genders are biological realities, they're now labeled as narrow-minded bigots. And the problem is that these international agreements is a type of form of what they call cultural imperialism, which will potentially impose on both learners and parents values that are simply not in their hearts, and it will do so through the public education system. So it is, I believe, something that is very problematic. We need to be aware of it, we need to be alerted to it, and we need to be ready, if people feel strongly enough about it, to push back against it.
So, Michael, this brings me to my last question. How should people stay informed on this issue? Because this is something that every parent, like you said, liberal, conservative, and every shade of parent in between should be concerned about. How do they stay informed?
Well, principally, I would suggest that they continue to track with 4SA on the forsa.org.za website. We obviously have our Facebook page, Freedom of Religion SA, and increasingly we're going to be using our 4SA YouTube channel to give people perhaps a more entertaining way of picking up on this type of very important news.
We hope, as if talking about sexual pleasure and sex ed isn't entertaining enough.
Exactly.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for your time today and for what I hope people will find to be an interesting discussion.
Thanks, Daniela.
Good day. This is Daniela Ellerbeck, the legal advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa. Remember to like and share this video and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.